Hi, welcome to TrueAbout. Today we have KeithTeare, who's the co-founder of TechCrunch, among other entrepreneurial endeavors. And I'd like to start by just asking you, Keith, what do you think is important to talk about today related to what you're interested in with business and technology?
Well, you know, we're living through a very particular moment in the history of technology. As you can see, I'm not a youngster, so I've lived through a few of these moments, and having done that, they're pretty easy to detect. It's when something profound is shifting the center of gravity completely in the tech world from where it was to a new place.
Mhm.
That happened when the desktop computer was invented, and suddenly we didn't have to use mainframes anymore on a kind of a time split basis.
Mhm.
It happened again when we were able to connect computers together and create networks. It happened a third time when we moved from local area networks to wide area networks and the internet in particular. Then it happened a fourth time when we moved from the early internet, which was portal based, to the modern internet, which is highly social and connected at the level of each person. And now we're having another huge shift away from computers altogether to mobile devices, smartphones and tablets. And whenever these changes happen, all of the things we built for the previous era,
Mhm.
even if it's quite new, in the case of the social internet, it's the last 5 years, suddenly becomes irrelevant. And completely new things start to grow up. And we see that today with Snapchat or Vine or, Whisper and WhatsApp. These are names that no one would have known even 2 years ago. And suddenly they've got hundreds of millions of users. So it's a huge shift and change that leaves the old washed up on the shore as the tide goes out.
So, what do you think is the big game changer with this new platform? I usually think of location as its key feature and internet everywhere. Um, and you're mentioning some companies that have grown, exclusively from that new platform, but there's definitely not been any Facebook or anything in the B's really that I've seen. I guess, well, Instagram sort of, but a really substantial company that stands its own ground yet.
Well, that always takes a while. Google emerged as a significant company only in about 1999, and search had been around since 1995. It's true that Facebook was right up until 2005, 6 was a tiny little company, but by 2010 was very, very significant. So it never happens in a heartbeat. But when you change the infrastructure that human beings use to connect to each other, it's impossible for huge new companies not to arise. Snapchat last week reportedly turned down a $3 billion acquisition by Facebook, which is 3 times what they paid for Instagram only 6 months later. And the speed at which things grow once they are adopted outpaces anything that the human race has ever seen. And so it could literally take a couple of months for somebody to come from nowhere to be bigger than Facebook could ever be. And it will happen. The question is when. Sometime in the next 3 or 4 years.
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree with you that 3 or 4 years is plenty of time to get a world-renowned company name out of the mobile platform.
The phone being in existence is just the starting point. In the first year of the iPhone's life, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it sold around 10 million,
Mm.
something like 10 million. At that point, the number of people on the internet was around a billion too.
Mm.
Today, the smartphones in the world is around about a billion too. Um, by the end of next year, it's going to be 2 billion, bigger than the number of people on the internet, actually. The number of people on the internet has barely grown in the last 2 or 3 years. The number of people on smartphones has caught up and is now surpassing the number of people on the internet via traditional means. So it's all about, It's kind of like, when the weather changes, you got to wear a raincoat. When something big that's all-encompassing changes, human beings react. And we're reacting right now by adopting smartphones in huge numbers that completely puts into the shade the numbers of PCs and laptops even in existence.
And it sounds like at some point the first-time internet users for these mobile devices will exceed the first-time use of people using a traditional computer, because there's so many poor people where, poor countries where people are just getting a new phone, and guess
Yeah.
what? The phone's going to be a smartphone,
Yeah.
eventually, right?
Right. My wife is South African. I've been traveling to South Africa for 20 years. And you go to South Africa and people from poor townships, which are basically neighborhoods where the houses are made of corrugated iron and cardboard boxes, have smartphones. They do not have internet in any other way. That's the only way they have it. They don't have landlines. They have wireless phones. And so, Nigeria has a population of 160 million. And that population above a certain age all have smartphones. So you're seeing, even in places like Africa, huge adoption of the latest technologies, and plans coming from the wireless carriers that are sustainable for people who earn salaries in those markets.
Mm-hmm. What else in technology are you interested in, or do you know about that's breaking a barrier in maybe some other realm?
Well, I've always focused on the software consequences of hardware changes. And so everything I do is about software. And if you think about the architecture of human-to-human communication, whether it's me to you, or me to everyone in the room, or me to the world, public communications, a new hardware platform puts in place new software possibilities. To be specific, in the Web 2.0 era, it was required, if you wanted to build a social network, to build a centralized one. You had to get everyone to put their contacts on your servers, and you managed on their behalf all the communications between you and your contacts.
Right.
So it's highly centralized, almost like a mainframe. And in that sense, quite old-fashioned architecturally. But the reason it had to be like that is we didn't all carry laptops around with us with our contacts on.
Right.
So somebody had to do it for us so we could log on and get stuff done. Well, with smartphones, suddenly we've got an address book that we carry around with us. All of our friends are in our pocket.
Right.
And our relationships to them are known by us in our heads. We know when we want to share a photo with these people, or when we want to share a video with those people, when we want to be public, when we want to be private. It's all of those rules, if you like, are under our control on the device that we carry around with us. And that's a highly decentralized model of software. So suddenly you can build, if you like, citizen software where the person is at the center of their own universe, in control,
Right.
rather than asking them to cede control to a centralized authority. It's, if you like, the capitalist version of software as opposed to the Stalinist version of software. In that world, Facebook is Stalin, Google is Lenin, and the new ecosystem of smartphones gives you the possibility of Adam Smith, where you truly have a free market with the user in control. So most of what I'm thinking about is what are the consequences of that for example, messaging software or photo sharing software. What are the consequences of that for SMS? What does it mean for the carriers? What does it mean for the old companies that were more centralized? Can they adapt? Can they adjust? So those are the kind of questions that I spend my time thinking about.
Let's bring big data and artificial intelligence into this. What do you think about, I guess, mostly it's going to be these mobile platforms accessing very powerful computers through the internet, the so-called cloud, that's going to be crunching data and doing machine learning. How do you think that's coming along, and where do you see that making the biggest changes, given these mobile platforms that are going to be accessing it?
Very good question, and very important question. I talk about the new cloud. The cloud, of course, has been around for, let's say, at least a decade. Salesforce.com goes back as at least 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. So the cloud's been around a long time, but the cloud up until 2010 was a centralized cloud, assuming a browser was the way that people consume software. And so what they did is they built all the apps and all the services to run on the servers. And you loaded your browser and then accessed those services through a browser. The new cloud is very different because mobile devices typically are not browser-centric. They still have a browser, people still use a browser, there's great developments in HTML5 there to make that a good experience. But the browser, from a volume point of view at least, is eclipsed by apps. Apps are taking way much more time than browsers out of people's lives. They're trying more apps, they're playing with the lots of different aspects of their life through these apps. And the cloud, therefore, needs to be more like an app support cloud. Well, so what is an app support cloud? It's a cloud that can do a lot of the heavy lifting on behalf of the app. For example, delivering alerts and notifications to your friends when you want them to know something, or storing your files so that you can get access to them anywhere you are, or doing heavy computational tasks where the CPU of the phone isn't powerful enough to carry them out, or where the storage on the phone doesn't have enough data on the hard drive or the flash drive to have the data always available to you on the device. You need to use the cloud for that. So it's, in a way, a support system to mobile as opposed to a centralized application system. And that new cloud is going to produce some huge new companies as well. Arguably, companies that are quite recent are already old-fashioned in that regard. They're providing the more centralized cloud services of the last era. And the companies which are emerging now, companies like Parse, which was just acquired by Facebook, or Lair, which just won the TechCrunch Disrupt conference startup competition in San Francisco. They are addressing more of the new needs of the cloud, which is to provide services to apps. A lot of them are message services, a lot of them are moving data around, is largely what they do. And big data then comes into its own because the cloud is, let's say I wear this Nike Fuel Band. This Nike Fuel Band attaches to my smartphone using Bluetooth, and the data from my daily habits gets uploaded to a cloud. That data sits alongside data of millions of other people who have these wristbands, and suddenly you can start to get aggregate knowledge. And I think that phrase aggregate knowledge is a key element of the future of the cloud about everyone who has a fuel band. And that aggregate knowledge leads to intelligence and the ability to act. For Nike, they start to understand user behaviors and what kind of features the product needs to have in the future from that. So I think iBeacons, which Apple just introduced with iOS 7, is another great example of this new cloud. An iBeacon is basically a low-power Bluetooth emitter. To be non-technical, it just sits usually in a store, right at a counter that maybe serves, I don't know, CDs, let's say. So whereas before, Walmart would know you're in the store because the Wi-Fi access point would see the MAC address of your phone, and they'd be able to tie that back to who you are based on all the various intelligence they have about you. Now they can know not just that you're in the store, but you're at the CD stand, and you're thinking of buying music. And that's what an iBeacon gives. Now the aggregate data of iBeacons from all of the stores in the world gives you a huge real-time view of consumer behavior.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that intelligent data cloud is a huge part of the future.
So to me, it sounds like we're maybe moving away from SaaS, software as a service, to PaaS, which is platform as a service, with the app layer being the differentiator between those two.
That's right. I think that's a good characterization. I mean, the cloud actually becomes bigger and more important than it was before, but different. And platform as a service is a decent way to describe exactly what the cloud is becoming. It doesn't really replace software as a service because there's going to be lots of applications for which software as a service still works.
Right.
But it'll be where the growth is.
Well, to segue a little bit, we're going to talk about a new hardware device, which, as you mentioned, hardware devices drive new software. And this one's Leap Motion, which is a infrared sensing device to build a 3D model of whatever you're placing over it. So in this simple software, I'm just going to spin my finger to advance pictures. And it's kind of fun. It works almost all the time if you get the gesture right. And this is the America's Cup. So there's a lot of beautiful pictures of sailboats and the city. And I wonder, what do you think about this type of interface?
Well, I love innovation in interface design. You could argue that the main thing the iPhone did was deliver software through a new interface, and it was sufficiently intuitive that 2-year-olds could get it. And gestures like moving your finger in front of a picture are similarly intuitive. So I think there's a huge place for this. There's a lot of competition. Some of the TV manufacturers, LG and Samsung in particular, have been showing Kinect-like cameras built into the TVs that create the possibility of interactive gesture-based control with the TV. And others are introducing voice as well. I think there's probably going to be a lot of innovation in how you interact with the device, and this is clearly one of them. I think there are use cases where it doesn't work well. For example, if you're sitting on a desk in front of a desktop, which of course we do less and less of the time, but if we were doing that, you don't want to be having to have your arm extended the whole time to make things happen, because you'll get tired. And that's why Jobs always resisted the idea of a touchscreen iMac, because he just, as they experimented with it, his arm got tired within a couple of minutes, and he wanted to put it down. But there's others, like with a TV, where it's an obvious innovation and a great way of delivering to a user functionality that would be hard to deliver otherwise.
I wanted to also ask you about what you think is the biggest innovation in human history. And I mean, you could start, there's something really recent, obviously, that's huge, but going all the way back, what would you pick as, I guess, maybe your favorite, if you don't want to claim authority on the most important human achievement?
Well, there's a lot. I'd probably start with the fire and water. Obviously, without fire, life would be pretty miserable. So the ability to heat things is huge. Survival itself depended on it a lot of the time, and the ability to get clean water that you could move around, also huge. People wouldn't, the knee-jerk reaction is say the wheel, because a lot of people talk about the wheel. I think that's pretty major as well. But the basic building blocks of life, which is shelter and heat, I'd go for those.
What about a historical figure, someone that you look up to a lot in history?
Well, actually, my answer to that will shock an American audience, but it's Karl Marx. And the reason I answered fire is somewhat related to that, because Marx was brilliant at understanding the relationship between infrastructure and superstructure. That is to say that by changing the conditions, the fundamentals, you change the details of life. And his whole understanding of human history was that the fundamentals of human interaction have evolved over time from, basically feudal, pre-feudal, feudal, capitalist. And he didn't believe that there was ever an end of history there. He thought that human beings would continue to evolve forms of social organization which would benefit the whole. And by benefiting the whole, also benefit the individual. He had this idea called, people don't know about this because they don't read Marx, but he had the idea called the total human being. And the total human being was the person that could emerge once the necessities of life could be produced in an automated fashion, and therefore work became optional,
Right.
and leisure became the norm. And he envisaged that, he has this phrase in one of his books that you could be a fisherman in the morning, a philosopher after dinner, blah blah, all because society as a whole had created the absence of need through automated production of the needs of life. So that relationship between the fundamentals and the details of life is what he brings to the table as a philosopher. Of course, I hate what's become known as communism.
Right. Yeah.
That is the opposite of what Marx talked about. It's basically top-down, brutal dictatorship. So I am not, and never was or will be, a communist. But I actually think I am a Marxist.
Oh, very interesting. It sounds like some of that Venn diagram that you showed us before.
An element of Marx called dialectics, which is not his idea. It comes from Hegel, and even before Hegel, a guy called Feuerbach, a German philosopher. But it's basically that any moment that you choose in history, you could draw two overlapping circles like this. This one represents the past, this one represents the future, and where they overlap represents the present. And the present is a conflict between those elements of the past which want to survive and those elements of the future which are trying to be born. When I did EasyNet, which was an internet service provider in the UK in 1994, this circle was British Telecom, and it only did one thing. It tried to slow down the emergence of the internet. And this circle was the internet that we have today. And in the middle there was a huge conflict between the telephone carriers and the new emerging internet service providers. And then because these guys won, we got Google, we got Yahoo, and everything that came with it. But in the moment in 1994 when we were doing it, we had the ability to change history if we understood a little bit about the likely future. And by placing bets on the things that we thought would win, we helped them actually win. And so the other element of it is human beings get to make history. As Marx said, not in conditions of their own choosing, but they do get to make history.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful interview, Keith.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.